Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second event of the Staying Close to Loss series as part of Stewarding Loss. My name is Ivor Williams, and I'm associate of the Stewarding Loss project. I'm also a designer, and in my role as the lead for end-of-life care at Imperial College, I work in and around dying, death, and loss, and that's something that I really I'm dedicated to across the board in lots of different ways. And I'm very happy today to have someone who also shares this amazing, unique interest and passion in using design to transform a relationship to death and grief, Jake Garber. Just one moment around Stewarding Loss. Stewarding Loss is a collective of organizational designers, social innovators and coaches dedicated to the renewal of civil society. Essentially, Stewarding Loss exists to contribute to a wider systemic shift whereby organizational ending or closure is considered within organizational strategy as normally as growth. And so Stewarding Loss practically supports organizations considering, facing, or designing a closure at this time or in the future with practical and emotional guidance and signposting to support them. Tonight, we're in conversation with Jake Garber. Jake is the director of Canopy, which is an organization dedicated to social imagination, or to growing social imagination, sorry. He was previously senior service designer at the innovation unit, where he led their end-of-life care project Better Endings, so suitable for tonight. He was also service designer at the very influential studio Participle, and he co-authored the Demos pamphlet Dying for Change with Charlie Leadbeater in 2010. Hello, Jake. How are you?
Hi, yeah, I'm well, thank you. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for doing this, and thanks for coming along. It's really exciting to kind of have this kind of conversation. It's kind of a very, I think with the first event we had with Stephen, we unpacked a lot of the kind of large philosophical and kind of almost theological ideas around death and loss in a very kind of poetic way. And the spirit of this project is really about thinking about the ways in which we can design, organize, and kind of facilitate better endings across different kind of scales. So with you, can you briefly just kind of introduce yourself? Can you say what you do and kind of in your own words, maybe talk about these concepts of ending and loss and closures, and what kind of comes to mind when you think about this, especially if we relate it to people or organizations or even institutions?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Ivor. And hi everyone. It's really nice to be here. I wanted to say, I guess, a little something before kind of launching in, which is sort of talking about closure, about death, about grief, about loss. We're going to be talking about that a lot today, and it's a triggering subject. I'm feeling quite raw today in a way, and you might not get me at my most bubbly, and just an invitation to everybody listening just to check in with how you're feeling. I want this conversation, I'm hoping this conversation will be an invitation for us all to be curious about some of these ideas, but also recognizing that they're difficult to think about, they're difficult to talk about, difficult to process. And so just a moment to sort of check in with where you're up to today, if you're tuning in. So in terms of me, and this is a sort of perfect invitation for me to be here just personally, because I'm in the process of ending an organization and starting a new one at the same time. I'm in the process of starting an organization that you mentioned, Canopy, with my colleague Hannah McDowell. And as you said, we're all about serving the social imagination, which means different ways of seeing, ways of being, and ways of doing that help us to participate in creating change. And my work's always been about social change in lots of different ways, through research, through design processes, in partnership with public services, with charities and communities. Spent years working with hospices in the UK, but also in other areas like early education, mental health and employment. And kind of always asking, how can we make this situation more life-giving by allowing more of what's naturally there, the space to express itself. So that's kind of what I'm about in a way. This topic of grief and loss is a personal one. It's kind of rooted in losing my dad, my grandparents arriving in the country as refugees, and these years of working in end-of-life care. And I think from my own experience, and even just from working around change in organisational development or community development, just this sense of grief being a kind of hidden force behind what's going on, behind what we do, the choices that people make, the way that people work together. And a hidden force because we don't acknowledge it, we don't talk about it, we don't process it. And so often lots of the things that we like to do, the life-giving things that we like to do, become disrupted because we're resistant to the loss that comes with change and the grief that's kind of embedded in that. So I kind of come with a bit of a question, really, which I think might have been the thing that Ivor you put on the Eventbrite, which is about if we really accept what grief is there an opportunity in it? So the experience of grief is an unbelievably painful one and not something we'd wish on anybody, or indeed any organisation, as this is the subject today. But we also know that it's a natural process and we can't be protected from it. We can only sort of deaden ourselves to it. So what if, rather than saying, okay, there's so much grief, there's lots of this in the papers at the moment, this sort of tsunami of grief with COVID, we must help people more, and I agree with that. But I think there's also something missing in that perhaps grief is also an opportunity. If it's a natural process, what is it doing? Why is it there? And if we saw it as an opportunity, what could we do? And how could it be helpful with the sort of big and small challenges we face? And that's kind of what I'm hoping we might get into discussion about today. And I think it's personal. I think it's also big picture. We are, as a society, facing lots of very significant challenges to the way that we live, our place in the world, racism, gender inequality, climate change, artificial intelligence posed to radically reshape our identities. All of these things contain grief and change. And so how can we my question is almost like, how can we unlock the power of grief to make the transformations that we want to see?
There's a lot there. So I want to kind of, I think it's a lovely framing. So can we take a moment to maybe unpack two things? Because I think it's useful to kind of get your kind of definition, and also for me to kind of find my way into when you describe things. So can you, as you said, like grief is a very personal, because it's a very, it's a very emotional sensation. It's a very visceral sensation, which is kind of embodied, right? It's a very kind of, if we've lost someone or lost something or lost, some element of ourselves, we kind of do go through that physical, emotional experience. So I think we all intimately kind of know what grief may be. I guess, is there ways to unpack the way in which you're talking about as an opportunity? So like, can you kind of speak to, are there kind of more, if you think that you're using this, you as a designer, almost you're asking it as a kind of optimistic or opening question, like what are the kind of typical opportunities that, we might more commonly use, which makes this quite a bold idea? Like, what is a usual opportunity for change that comes across the table with in design, for example?
I guess the usual opportunities are about more. They're about how do we do more of things? How do we use the organizations, the processes that we already have to reach more new people, or increase our, our effectiveness? And actually, I almost quite want to go back to Stephen Jenkinson last week, when he talked about grief being a skill we need to grow. I really enjoyed it when he said that. And I feel like he was talking about how this sort of white patriarchal society that we're part of has disavowed grief and said there has to be constant increase in profit. And I feel like that perspective is very much embedded in the world in which we operate. And I think that includes within the domain of civil society, where even though there's not profit in the same way, I think those sort of modes of operating, modes of thinking are often borrowed from the corporate world. Not always. And grief doesn't fit because it's not in that mode. It's not constant increase. And actually the thing is that it can't be controlled. It's, we have this kind of this myth that from the Enlightenment, really, that sort of human progress is about onwards greater control and sort of mastery of our environment. And I really feel like we're seeing that perspective break down at the moment in lots of different ways in society, but I don't think we fully got to grips with the different ways of, in the language that we talked about with social imagination, the different ways of seeing, being and doing that are, that sort of go hand in hand with, in a sense, letting go of some of that, that control.
And so, because you talked about grief being a natural experience, which, in terms of the one of the ideas of stewarding loss is really about the renewal of things. And so this kind of the natural cycle, I think, we've one of the biggest things I've tried to do over the last 2 years is kind of replace, I think we've talked about this before, mechanistic kind of metaphors for more naturalistic metaphors, because it's a kind of quirk of the Enlightenment that, we kind of try and atomize and make things, take things apart and kind of see them as components and put them back together again. Which is not really how nature works. It kind of, it fails, it breaks, it kind of, heals, in different ways. So this idea of kind of natural is correct, but it's kind of, grief is also, to what extent is grief unwanted? Like, I'm kind of curious, maybe we can kind of hone in on specifics, because you mentioned just at the start that you're going through your own kind of organizational end, right? So to what extent can you speak about that in particular as being a natural or wanted or unwanted experience? Because it's obviously very kind of fraught with emotions. So can you just talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in what you just said to sort of work out exactly where to pick up. But maybe I'll just start in our experience with our former organisation, Wigs and Canopy. Actually, I think one of the key things to say about grief is that it is intrinsically ambivalent, I think. So when you say, is it wanted? I think the answer is it's both wanted and unwanted. So there's a sense in which it's deeply disruptive, troubling, painful, destabilizing in many different ways. And in other ways, it points to renewal, to freedom, to kind of reconnection with purpose, renewal of relationships. and a sort of reconnection with wholeheartedness, and I think those things are inevitably present at the same time. And maybe it's helpful to say a little bit more about the ways in which I'm using the word grief, because I think it's quite central here. And I'm gonna hold a book.
The dictionary.
Exactly. I'm gonna this book, Loss and Change by Peter Marius. It's an excellent book from the 70s, which you probably already read. But he's an anthropologist, and he's talking about basically he looked at a whole load of different situations. He's interested in social change. He does interviews with widows in London, with displaced communities in Nigeria, with college students in America. His focus isn't loss, dying and death, but at the end of his career, he wrote this book trying to understand the links between the different things that were happening, and what the sort of hidden force, the links that he found was this idea that our relationship to loss forms our response to all of those different situations. There's a sense in which it's universal, and he's drawing on lots of other thinkers. But really what he talks about is grief being a kind of fundamental disruption to our identity, and that being kind of composed of our identity being sort of inhabited in our activities, the things we do. So this is relevant for organizational endings. It's relevant for our identity is made up of our relationships, again relevant for organizational endings, our beliefs about ourselves and our place in the world. And for him, grief is a creative process, and that's, I think, where I'm going with this, that it's a creative process of remaking our identities once our identity has been broken, because something has happened which has disrupted it. And that could be losing something, but it could also be a change in context. So, for example, gentrification disrupts our identity in a way which can cause us grief. And so grief is, as I see it, following him, this kind of ongoing, not time-bound process, which is ambivalent. We hold different conflicted feelings at the same time. Conflict is actually often characteristic of it, it's painful, and essentially, more than anything, it's a process of meaning making, of creating a new meaning for ourselves by drawing on what was meaningful in the past but is not meaningful anymore because of the disruption, but going through the pain of reconnecting with the past to retrieve that meaning. And also going into the future, which has also been disrupted because what we understood about what was going to happen next has been disrupted, and going again into the future, even though that's also painful, to bring back what we need to make meaning of now. And so that's why I think it's a creative process. That's what I think we're talking about when we're talking about grief. And rather than being something that is awkward and painful and private and needs to be kind of damped down and controlled and separated off, what I'm suggesting is that this incredibly powerful process of meaning making, we need to learn how to support it and share it and create spaces where it can happen together, rather than just kind of damping it down.
Yeah, that you're talking about, grief as a creative process is that's kind of, when you're speaking about the idea of what is the opportunity, right? And I think you're starting to open up there. And I think when you talk about meaning making, I often think in end of life care and people living with terminal conditions and diseases, and when the kind of the choices are limited, and kind of mortality is very salient, or when people are living with a loss, this idea of making meaning becomes almost like the core task of things, right? And all of humanity, we're constantly trying to make sense of stuff. We're constantly trying to make sense of and make meaning from living in a pandemic and just in everyday life. But yeah, when mortality is included, it becomes a core task. And you're saying this thing about making meaning can be creative. It doesn't have to be this somber sort of like resolution of like, oh well, now it all fits into place and great, I can now kind of be at peace. It can actually be a fantastic way of enlivening things, right?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of fascinated by the kind of things that bring up. Can you speak to the creative process that might be involved in? Does anything from your own practice kind of come to mind when you think about that kind of framing, or is it something that is just where you're at right now and you're not too sure what it looks like?
The answer is both. So I thought maybe I would talk about a project which I'm working on at the moment, but which is towards the end. But of course, I don't have all of the answers. Like, this is something that I want to learn how to do with others, and I want to learn what other people are doing. So this is just one kind of tiny little sort of drop in the ocean kind of suggestion, but perhaps it does also kind of bring it to life in some ways. So I've just been running a project called The Dark is Bright, which was funded by the lottery, and we've been running it over the course of lockdown with two other partner organisations, one called the Loss Project, who are all about creating space for processing loss in society, and another called Rooted, who are all about centering the experiences of Black communities living in Britain. And we ran a program, a 10-week program online. We made a sort of public call for participants, for people who've experienced significant losses recently. And we took them through a process of connecting, getting to know each other, witnessing each other's loss, telling stories. We took them through a whole load of different sort of creative processes: drawing, writing, traditional storytelling. We did some work to help people identify from their stories what was important, what really stayed with them from their stories. And then we went through this kind of strange pivot, which felt weird when we were suggesting it, but actually people really went with it, which was that we put people into people got together into small groups, and they made fiction films, some of them science fiction films, sort of future-facing films, about what was important in their story and what that meant for the wider world. And we had some incredibly powerful films that were made. We had people talking from the perspective of a very old tree about aging and the invisibility, in particular, of older women in society. We had a film about a prisoner being released from prison on an alien planet, which was made by one of the survivors of the recent London Bridge terror attack, which is in the news again at the moment, talking about how we give space for prisoners to change, and how we treat them more humanely. We had a whole range of films, and we're just starting to sort of convene conversations around those films at the moment. And that process has been, for some of the members who've taken part, that's had a big effect on how they see themselves, how they relate to their own story, how they communicate with others. but what we're really hoping at the moment is that they will start to spark conversations more broadly about the issues that are kind of contained in those films. So in a sense, the experience of loss and the grief that these people are experiencing is the energy, is the kind of the dynamite or whatever, to kind of push some of these things forwards. This is the first time we've done a process like this, but we're kind of intrigued about whether you could run a process like this perhaps within an organisation or within a community or a system of organisations, to surface some of those really deeply important stories, and then to host conversations around the outside that help people to make meaning together and make decisions about what should be next based on a new way of making meaning. And I think one of the pieces that's been very powerful in this is actually we worked with one of our team is a traditional storyteller, and we've been telling traditional stories as companions for people's own experiences. So you can kind of translate your experience onto these sort of mythical stories, and you've got another world in which to operate, another world in which your ideas can evolve, which is less, it's still very beautiful and you're connected to it emotionally, but it's less, in some ways it's less heavy, you're more liberated in that world. And in a sense, we wonder if these films could also operate in that way for the communities that they're offered into, that they create a larger thinking space for this meaning making. And I guess just to share a tiny little bit more about why we use this process. So there's a thinker that I like very much called Donna Haraway, who talks about story as thinking. So rather than analyzing something, breaking it down into pieces, we actually do our thinking through telling stories. And one of the advantages of this is that stories are so good at containing paradox and complexity in a way that analysis is very, very poor. And because we know that grief is an ambivalent, conflicted process, stories feel like the right type of container, the right type of thinking process for this kind of meaning making, rather than a kind of linear, let's, as a designer, let's get the post-its lined up on the wall and organize things. Actually, somehow narrative is a much more helpful kind of organizing principle.
Which kind of goes to this idea of this, I'm going to like misattribute Viktor Frankl, but this idea of, if you can figure out if you can cope with the why, you'll be able to do anything with the what. Like if you can make sense and kind of understand why things are happening. Yeah, that's super interesting. So my kind of my interest in storytelling, I guess, comes from a similar vein, which is just around the way in which they, for most of human history, we've kind of encoded our culture through storytelling as the kind of mimetic kind of way of transmitting values and values and kind of myths and kind of culturally important things. So this idea of stories being good at paradox and complexity, therefore stories being good at being able to contain the kind of facets of something as complex as grief, seems like a strong, useful tool almost. Can you, to kind of place that in the context of this series and this kind of work, would you suggest, or what would you say to that idea that if you were an organization that was going through a transition, a very difficult phase, would the first task almost be like, tell us the story of this organization, this group of people, and would you kind of how specialized do you think it is to tell a story? Or do you think we're all capable of doing it? Is it something that's skilled or something that's actually everyday?
Yeah, it's a nice question, Ivor. I mean, I there is a skill in being a storyteller in the way that Hannah, who we've worked with, is.
Mm.
But I absolutely believe that this is something that everybody not only can do but needs to do. I think that people need the opportunity to tell their own stories, and that a story is not a sort of static monolithic structure, that it's something that evolves over time. Now I'm just going to steal all of Hannah's ideas. She had her here instead of me, but she talks about the oral tradition, the importance of the oral tradition, that when we write down or record a story, it becomes fixed in a certain way that actually is not totally in keeping with the kind of natural flows of life, and in particular of grief being evolving over time and conflicted and all this kind of stuff, that actually the oral mode lends itself much better to storytelling. And it's something that everybody can do, and that support around it can be very helpful. But I wonder if it's the first thing to be done, because it's very difficult to tell your story if you don't feel safe, if you feel exposed in any way with others, or if you feel like actually your emotions are not welcome, that your telling of the story might trigger emotions that would be difficult to express. So I kind of if you're the leader of an organization, or you hold a kind of leadership role within an organization that's thinking about closure or transition in these ways, where my mind goes first of all is the work of Ronald Heifetz. If you know him, his work on adaptive leadership, he talks about he talks in particular about kind of leading as holding. Like, how do you create holding spaces in which people can do the work that's needed? And I was thinking about, the work with hospices, what people go through when they're dying, when they're grieving, and I think it's very similar to the experiences that people have when their identity is disrupted significantly, perhaps through organizational ending. And that's comfort and pain is an enormous issue. As we've said, I think meaning is absolutely central. And then this sense of sort of ambivalence and conflict. And I think these all speak to the qualities of this holding space that's needed. That I feel like it's in this situation, the job of leaders to create a space where conflict is possible, because conflict is part of the grieving process, and ambivalence is possible, that people might have many different feelings pulling them in different directions. And Heifetz talks about, he's not talking about organizational endings, he's talking about change, but one of the phrases he uses is for leaders to regulate the distress. So it's kind of sensing how much it's right to push, how much it's right to expose, and how much it's right to hold steady and create spaces where people feel safe. And I really think that part of what feeling safe is about here is about feeling connected to others. So that's just, it's a very simple thing, but it's not always part of how we work when we're very task orientated. But actually feeling like we're in a heart-based way, humanly connected to the people that we're with, I feel like that's a really central part of this kind of holding space, and part of what we were trying to create in this Dark is Bright project too.
Yeah, nice, really nice. Things that come to mind are like the prerequisites then that, say, if you are a leader or you have a chief exec or someone in a leadership position, that the work required is first and foremost inner work, right? Because you have to be able to kind of be comfortable. You cannot ask of people to be exposing themselves if you can't do it yourself first. And so I imagine the kind of the complications that arise are, are people willing to accept a certain amount of pain and difficulty themselves to kind of get the process going? And so that kind of leads me to thinking about kind of Brene Brown's work around vulnerability and so I think there's lots of things that, you keep name dropping really great references. I wonder if you can, to kind of capture them afterwards, because it's like, that kind of stuff it's translatable to a certain degree about, psychological safety in the workplace and kind of within groups. And this, this idea that one of the things I find fascinating about grief is the kind of subcategories, and one of which I find particularly potent is this idea of unacknowledged grief. I've kind of written about in terms of relations to climate grief, this idea that half the torment I think people feel in the West, but more importantly and more significantly in kind of communities around the world, indigenous communities and such, is that people are just like denying it's even happening, right? And people are denied the chance to even feel their grief on a kind of cultural level or societal level, right? Because people don't want to hear about it, and they kind of, if you imagine the kind of protesters of Extinction Rebellion, like people just think they're crazy, and it's like, no, these people are really feeling grief, and the fact that you deny it makes it even worse. And so this kind of, the more things go unacknowledged, and so people have to kind of step up to the plate and do the work themselves, I guess, to kind of make that acknowledgement easier to do, right? And so, this prerequisite of an emotional intelligence, which, is, I don't know how common that happens amongst different groups. It seems like amongst the kind of design community, it's kind of, we, to even almost go back right to the start, you talked about, the big societal shifts that are happening around, technology and artificial intelligence. As we become more kind of automated, the role of the emotional mind becomes all more important, and as a skill that needs to be cultivated. Seems like a foundational element to do any of this work is to have that emotional capability.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we all have that. I think it's insanely hard.
Yeah.
When you talk about Brené Brown vulnerability, I'm a beginner. I'm this project that I've just done has been incredibly painful for me, and the way I've dealt with that hasn't always been great. Like, it's really hard. And I kind of, in a sense, almost want to go back to what Stephen was saying last week as well, where he was to sort of contextualize this a bit, because I think it's, we're always tempted to locate this in the individual, and say, as an individual, I've got to be totally self-sufficient, impervious, perfect, and then I'll be able to do this great work. And I think the beautiful point that Stephen made last week was about actually how it's not about you, it's a cultural issue, that actually our culture isn't creating supportive conditions for this. It's not, it feels really unfair that this work requires of each of us to be sort of somehow superhuman. I believe that we've all got the emotional capacity and intelligence to do this. I'm sure we've all got lots of learning to do as well. But I'm also really interested in the sort of cultural elements that can support this work, as well as the, I think it goes hand in hand with the internal elements. And I was thinking about Sobonfu Somi, who wrote The Spirit of Intimacy. The way she talks about ritual I like very much, and it totally opened my eyes when I read it, because, you know, to a sort of not religious person growing up in the UK, my idea of ritual is sort of, you know, my sort of picture book idea of ritual is something sort of unusual, that has a certain code that you kind of do at certain moments. And I feel like it's such an impoverished view of ritual that she talks about ritual as being the kind of importance of the communal witnessing of some transition or something that's happened. And I feel like we're unpracticed at creating those situations where that communal witnessing can happen. And she also talks about the importance of the sort of almost creativity and spontaneity of ritual. So rather than being a sort of rote, you know, every time you do this, she talks about actually ritual must be created by its participants. It must be to be really sort of, let's say, sort of potent, that the people who are participating in it need to be able to need to bring what they need into it, bring their objects, their emotions, their experiences, their ideas. And I'm going to give a tiny little example of this, which is, it's tiny. I did this interview with a woman who had lost her mother during the first lockdown, and it had been incredibly complicated. She'd been estranged from, you know, she hadn't been able to have contact. Her mum was in a nursing home. It had been really distressing and painful. And then for the funeral, she was told there was only allowed to be, I can't remember what it was at that point, like 10 people there or 5 people there. And her mother was somebody who was very, very sociable. And she was arguing with the funeral director about, you know, what can they do. And she had this idea. Her mum liked to she liked collecting pebbles on beaches, and she said she wanted to bring a handful of these pebbles to the funeral and put them on the coffin. And the funeral director said no, because it wasn't COVID friendly, but she did it anyway. And she said when she was there, when she did it, she realized each of those stones represented somebody who wasn't able to be there at the funeral. And just in a very small way, there's something, she didn't plan it to say, okay, I'm going to bring this for this person, this for this person. There's something just very intuitive and emergent about that process. And I was so inspired by this woman's story. And I feel like we can all tap into that if we're given space to. We can all tap into that ability to create those moments, those rituals, which witness those transitions and help us in that journey of making meaning.
Yeah. There's something very kind of so powerful about the idea of the stone as a kind of component part of something larger, right? There's, as you were saying, I'm like, yes, there was, I remember there was a great, I think it was a New York Times piece recently going back to the northern Italian towns where COVID kind of came into Europe. And it was like a year later, so this is maybe about in March, and they talked about these towns were starting to build memorials, and different towns had taken different approaches. Like one had kind of hired an architect to build a sort of dramatic sort of, you know, marble thing in the town and everything else. And some had kind of like commissioned kind of just ongoing flowers or whatever it might be. But one town had basically done something similar where they basically, a guy just started putting a rock for every person that had been lost, and it just turned into this giant mound of stones. And its presence and its kind of energy, you know, that kind of idea of lifting a rock and placing it, you know, kind of there's an energy held inside of it. It's something really powerful about this idea that you don't know which stone's yours at that point. you know, it kind of gets covered by others, and there's something, the kind of congregation of things has been quite a powerful sensation, a very physical sensation that is kind of hard to beat. So it's kind of amazing that, you know, it's a spontaneous idea that appears again and again. This idea of communal witnessing, I think, is really, really powerful, because I think part of what we suffer from in the UK in particular, and it's kind of, you can trace it back to certain things around why we're not able to witness or participate in communal acts of grief, you know, and so this idea of collective grief has kind of come up quite a lot in the last year. How would you, like, it's kind of hard to try and leverage, or to try and, you know, work with that in terms of kind of going with the grain, you know, with that kind of work. But I'm kind of curious as to what the kind of, are there other conditions that are required for groups to do that work? Because you've talked about safety, the feeling of safety. Is there that kind of submission almost? You know, I wonder if that's kind of the next step, is that you have to kind of commit yourself to kind of just seeing where you go. I'm kind of recalling kind of the grief circles that were kind of came out in the 1970s, where people would participate around, you know, around a circle, and they'd come in as a group, and they would just move in. They'd move into a circle, an inner circle, kind of painted on the ground, and until they kind of touched bottom. You know, the innermost circles where you're touching bottom, and it's kind of, at that point, people are feeling very raw and feeling very kind of emotionally open. But it kind of does require that kind of, that sort of opening up and kind of letting go of things. How would you kind of, you know, is there a way to facilitate that, or do you kind of have to sort of just let it happen if it happens?
It's a nice question. You might have asked it to the wrong person, in the sense that it's not really my expertise. I think I can talk to some of the conditions, but there are people who have a beautiful and deep practice around this that, you know, I couldn't really approach, if you know what I mean. And I'm sure Stephen, who we saw last week, is one of those people. The Loss Project, our partners on the project I spoke about, are also, that's much more their expertise. But I guess I was thinking about your question in relation to, you know, the audience for this this conversation, which is people who are thinking about organisational endings. Just one condition to talk to is perhaps something about power. Especially in terms of meaning making and narrative, that I think this sort of sense of safety, people need to be able to trust that they are genuinely able to make meaning for themselves, and for their meaning to be acknowledged and appreciated and witnessed, regardless of whether it's in conflict with somebody else's meaning, or the sort of bigger organizational narrative. And I think that is, in a sense, the tricky challenge for people doing this work to think about from an organizational perspective is, everybody's got a lot at stake in sense of their own stories and the wider public story. And again, this is why I think working in the sort of oral tradition is helpful, rather than sort of writing things down. But, you know, how do you help people to, feel confident in those things, I think is probably going to be really key. And then the other thing is go into nature. Like, just, it makes all of these conversations better. That's my other top tip.
So this, because this, you know, again, to use and to reinforce the idea of grief as a natural part of a process of loss. And so, you know, it can be interrupted, it can be suppressed, it can be made difficult by many different things, either conscious or unconscious, but nevertheless, it's a natural experience, because it's, you know, the thing I always love coming back to, I think it was even attributed to the Queen on Prince Philip's death, was, you know, grief is the price you pay for love, right? So like, to take some more of the ideas of renewal, what do you think grief allows us to give birth to? You kind of talked a little bit around reconnecting with purpose at the start. Can you kind of maybe summarize some of the things that you think are created or recreated or renewed when we work with this kind of very, very dense, very complex, very emotional set of things?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. What I want to do is, here we go. I want to show you a picture. I just had to turn my self view on. So I drew a picture, which is probably a picture that lots of you have seen before in different ways. It's called the eco cycle. You can Google it, and it's this sort of figure of 8 pattern that you sort of trace round from incubation round into birth, into maturity, into death, and then this part is what you're talking about right now, Ivor, which is in a natural context, you might call it sort of composting. You're kind of putting the nutrients back into the soil, to sort of extend the natural metaphor. I have to hide my selfie so that I don't get and I think that's the phase that's missing in our kind of worldview in the West. You know, we're all about birth and maturity, innovation. Let's make new things, and then let's protect the kind of systems that we have. But it's recognizing that this is a natural process, that all the things that we know about, that we're in contact with, are natural systems, and all of these natural living systems go through this process. And so in terms of what happens when we go from maturity through death or endings or closure, and then through into incubation and then into birth, what we're doing is we're releasing energy. So lots of energy gets caught up in something that's gone past its maturity. It's no longer producing fruit. And we're spending lots of time trying to keep it into maturity, but it's no longer really functioning there. And actually, our energy could be better placed elsewhere. You know, I think there's lots of practical things in this world, sort of funding, attention, narratives, all these sorts of things that kind of it's a freeing process as well as a deeply distressing process. And I think one of the reasons that I wanted to show the picture in particular was because I wanted to, I'm quite a practical person, I wanted to offer a practical suggestion to people who are listening, which is that something that's very nice to do is that you can walk the eco cycle. So you can map this shape out in your room or in the park as a figure of 8 with spaces for incubation, for birth, for maturity, and for death. And you can walk it sort of in meditation, and you can notice what comes up for you in the different spaces. Because the truth is, we're never in one space. We're always in all of the spaces. We're not just in ending. We're in ending and beginning and maturity all at the same time. And this can be something that can help us get some clarity when everything feels a bit chaotic or a bit distressing or whatever. it's an embodied process, and it's nice to do something with our bodies. And our bodies know a lot. They know a lot more than our sort of cognitive mind often does. And so things can come up through this process of walking. And this is, I've used this on my own. I've also used this in organizational contexts. Groups of people can walk this, or people can walk this individually and bring their insights back together. So it can also be a nice process of meaning making and observing together. So it was that was a bit of a riff on your question, really, but
super nice.
I wanted to get it in there.
Yeah, super nice, because I think it points to a really nice, and thank you for showing the diagram, because it speaks really eloquently to this opportunity to move beyond, all our lives are kind of open-ended and linear. So, we all live in our calendars, or we all live in our phones, and we all live in these when we think about our day-to-day lives and the way in which we operate, say in the workplace, or how we kind of build strategies for the future, like they're kind of open-ended and kind of in a line. And what you're describing there is like really nice and simple reminder that, whenever you start something, you're setting yourself in motion for it to end as well. And that is not something to be, I guess, it can be feared, because it's change, and change is scary, and it might happen before you want it to, but it's kind of part of the deal, or the part of the bargain of participating in growth, is that it was composted and grown from something preceding you. And it's nice to think of it. I hope if nothing else, to kind of remind ourselves, or to bring to the front of our mind, that these paradigms that we can take for granted can be redrawn, right, and can be rethought of. So it's the eco cycle. And this idea of the body knowing as well, I think, is really nice. And I kind of wonder, like, again, scaling it, with a group of people, by extension, groups of people know, a collective body knows when things are wrong, and when things are kind of awry. And to kind of deny, or to suppress that kind of intuitive embodied awareness, is a problem, but then also a wonderful opportunity to leverage as well, to think about how we can bring people to those senses, and to kind of work with those. Super nice.
Lovely. I wonder if I could, I notice we're sort of towards the end, but maybe can I just, would it be appropriate for me to make a few closing comments, Ivor?
Please do, Jake. Please do.
All right, brilliant, thank you. So, there's loads more that I'd love to talk about, but I'm going to keep it really short. Just in the frame of this conversation, the purpose of this conversation around sort of organizational endings, I really think co-designing the end of an organization, why not? Right? Why not? And I think the things that I would suggest, from what what little I've learned about what you would think about if you were doing that, is that you would think about spaces which can provide comfort and connection. You would think about spaces that can hold conflict, and you'd create spaces where meaning can be made. And that's where I think some of the story stuff comes into. And, in some ways that can sound really heavy, but I really go back to the original question is, what if grief isn't just this heavy, private, individual thing? What if it's our creative wellspring? What if it's, that bit that we're missing that helps us go back round again, that otherwise we're getting stuck in? And I think in the spirit of that, I was in conversation with a poet recently who was saying that something in its purest form contains its opposite. And this, I think, something that I've experienced in working with loss and grief, and I've seen in colleagues who work in hospices, who work around death day in, day out, is this deep desire and connection to play and joy and creativity, not as an escape, but as part of the fullness of life. And so really that's what I'm interested in. How can we learn new ways of, or remember old ways of connecting around that?
Wonderful. Thank you, Jake.
Thanks, Ivor.
Yeah, we could keep talking, and I think there's so much to kind of pick apart from that. So I'm going to come away thinking about lots of things we're talking about. Thank you so much for bringing all that, the rawness. You know, as you said, there's lots of change that you're experiencing, you're participating in. So thanks for bringing that. Thank you for the kind of peppering of all those kind of wonderful touch points of thoughts and thinking. Lots to chew on. I'm just going to say thank you to everyone who's joining, for listening. We are the second event. We have a number still to come. The times are to be confirmed, but please keep an eye out on the Stewarding Loss. Twitter is usually the best place to keep an eye out. It's at Stewarding Loss, and I look forward to seeing you all soon, and to have more of these amazing kind of consciousness and kind of intellectually expanding conversations about how we can deal with closures and endings. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks, Ivor. Thanks for having me. It's been brilliant.
Bye-bye.